Maigret and the Spinster by George Simenon. Part 1, Chapter 3.
Maigret had been known to shrug when people expressed amazement at the resignation of the poor, the sick, and the handicapped, the thousands upon thousands of solitary men and women without hope, each confined to a separate little cell in the big city. He knew from experience that man could adapt to any environment once it was filled with his own warmth and his own familiar smells and habits. The lodge where he was now sitting, in a creaking cane armchair, was barely 8 feet by 10 in area. The ceiling was low. The uncurtained glass door opened onto a dark hall, for the only light on the stairs was operated by a time switch near the front door, a bed with a red eiderdown. On the table, the glutinous remains of a pig's trotter, crumbs on the brown oilcloth cover, a knife, dregs of bluish wine in a glass. Seated opposite, Madame Saving Your Presence was speaking, her cheek practically welded to her shoulder as a result of chronic arthritis of the neck, her throat wrapped in thermogene wool, the ugly pink edge of which showed above her black shawl. "No, Chief Superintendent, Saving Your Presence, I won't sit in the armchair. It belonged to my late husband, and, in spite of my age and all my little aches and pains, I won't wish to take the liberty." A smell of stale cat's urine. The cat, a Tom, was stretched out in front of the stove, purring. The electric light bulb, dimmed by 20 years of accumulation of dust on the shade, emitted a reddish glow. From somewhere came the sound of rain dripping into a sink bucket, and every few seconds the roar of a car speeding along the highway, or the rumble of a truck, or the screeching of streetcar brakes. As I was saying, Saving Your Presence, the poor lady was our landlord. Juliette Boynet was her married name, and when I say poor lady, Chief Superintendent, sir, it's out of respect for the dead, because she was a real bitch, God rest her soul. What's more, it was something to be grateful for, when the good Lord, a few months ago, deprived her of the use of her legs up to a point. It's not that I want to be spiteful, but when she could get around like the rest of us, life just wasn't worth living. When he had checked with the Berger police station, Maigret had been astonished to learn that the dead woman was not yet 60, for in spite of her crudely dyed hair, she had looked older, with her bloated face and big, bulging eyes. Juliette Marie Jean Léontine Boynet, lée Cazeneuve, aged 59, born at Fontenay-le-Comte, Vendée, housewife. With her twisted neck, her hair screwed up in a meager little bun, her black woolen shawl tightly drawn over her scrawny bosom, the very thought of the old concierge's withered breasts caused him to shudder. Madame Saving Your Presence gloatingly savoured her words as early as she had savoured her pig's trotter, pausing at intervals to direct a glance at the glass door. "As you see, this is a quiet house. At this hour everyone, or nearly everyone, is at home. How long has Madame Boynet been the owner of the building? Since it was built, I should think. Her husband was a building contractor. He built several houses in Berger. He died young. He was under 50, and it was the best thing that could have happened to him. Poor man. After his death, she came here to live. That was 15 years ago. Saving Your Presence, she was just as bad then as she was when she died, except that she had the use of her legs and was always on my back. She was just as bad with the tenants. God help the owner if she ever caught sight of a dog or a cat on the stairs, and if ever anyone screwed up the courage to ask her to carry out any repairs. You see what I mean when I tell you that this building was the last of the whole of this area to be converted to electricity." They could hear footsteps on the second floor, and a baby crying. "That's Madame Boynet," explained Madame Saving Your Presence. "Her husband is a commercial traveler. He has a small car. He's probably away at the moment, covering the southwestern territory. He's usually away for 3 months at a time. They have 4 children already, and are expecting a 5th, in spite of the fuss there's been over the baby carriage. Madame Boynet, God rest her soul, would never allow them to leave it in the lobby, so it has to be carted up and downstairs twice a day. There now, that's their maid taking down the garbage can. The light went on, and a wizened woman in a white apron came into view. The huge galvanized iron can that she was clasping to her stomach gave her a deformed appearance. What was I saying? Oh, yes, you won't say no to a glass of wine, will you, Chief Superintendent? But you must. I have one good bottle left, a present from Monsieur Bonniquet. He's in the wine trade, you see. Well, one fine day, about 12 years ago, Madame Boynet's sister, who was also a widow, died at Fontenay, and Madame Boynet sent for her 3 children, 2 girls and a boy. Everyone in the neighborhood was amazed at this generosity. In those days, she occupied the whole of the 5th floor. The boy, Monsieur Gerard, was the first to get away. He enlisted in the army to escape from his aunt's clutches, no doubt, and then he got married. He lives in Paris, somewhere near the Bastille. He hardly ever shows up here. I have the impression he hasn't done too well for himself. Have you seen him recently? Mostly he waits for his sister outside. He doesn't suffer from false pride. His wife is another one who's expecting a baby. He was here last week and went up to the apartment. He needed money, I think. He didn't look very happy when he came down again. The fact is, if you wanted to persuade the old lady to part with her money, saving your presence, you had to be a very early bird. You're very good health. She turned around sharply and stared at the door. The light had not been switched on. Still, a faint rustling could be heard. Madame, saving her presence, got up and swiftly opened the door. A girlish figure could be seen slinking away. Loitering on the staircase as usual, Mademoiselle Nouchy, you should be ashamed of yourself. She sat down again. That's the trouble with having a place this size to look after, she grumbled. Those people, they are the 5th floor tenants, the old lady's nearest neighbors. But as I was saying, first, Monsieur Gerard went off to join the army. Then the younger sister, Bertha, who didn't get on with her aunt either, walked out. She's a salesgirl at the Galerie Lafayette. The old woman took the chance and rented half of the apartment space to the Hungarian family, the Sivachy. They have 2 daughters, Nouchy and Putzi. Putzi is the fat one, and she's most of the time loafing around half naked. Mind you, that Nouchy, who is only 16, isn't much better. She goes with men at night, in any dark corner she can find, sometimes even in the entrance hall. The best thing, he felt, was to let the concierge have her say, and make the best sense he could of it. Thus, the 2nd floor tenants were named Berger. The father was out of town, there were 4 children and the 5th expected, and they kept a maid. The 5th floor tenants were the Sivachy. Maigret had his first taste of the family that morning, in the person of the fat and shameless Putzi. He had now also seen the skinny one, Nouchy. Their mother doesn't believe in discipline. People like them don't know about manners and dignity. Listen to this. Only last week, when I took up their mail, I knocked, as usual. Someone called out, "Come in." I opened the door in all innocence, and what do I see? Madame Sivachy, stark naked, smoking a cigarette. She wasn't even embarrassed, and her daughters were there with her in the room. What is Monsieur Sivachy's profession? His profession, my poor dear sir, saving your presence. He comes and goes. He always has books under his arm. He's the one who does the household shopping. He's 2 quarters behind with the rent, but you won't catch him hiding from the rent collector. Rather, he seems to look on his visits as something of a joke. Now, poor little Monsieur Legrand, Monsieur Gaston, as I call him, he's very different. He keeps the bicycle shop, a thoroughly honorable little man who started life selling newspapers and pulled himself up by his bootstraps. Sometimes he finds himself short at the end of the month, and when that happens, I swear to you, he can scarcely look his neighbors in the face, not even me, although he's been married barely 3 months, and, to save paying rent for lodgings, they sleep at the back of the shop, all among the spare wheels and tires. Well, I bet you that pest, Nouchy. It was Maigret who went to the door, having spotted a shadowy figure lurking outside. It was indeed the little Hungarian, with her big dark eyes and her mouth like a bleeding gash. "What do you want?" he asked. She replied, not in the least put out. "I wanted to see you. I was told that the famous chief superintendent Maigret, She looked him straight in the eye. Although she was thin, with no hips to speak of, her breasts, by contrast, were well developed and pointed and accentuated by her dress, which was a size too small for her. Very well, now you've seen me. Don't I get asked any questions? Have you anything to tell me? Maybe. Outraged, Madame, saving your presence, sighed and shook her head as vigorously as her stiff neck would permit. Come in, what's all this about? Nushi skipped into the lodge as though she belonged there. She was triumphant. Maybe someone had dared her to accost the chief superintendent. I wanted to tell you about Monsieur Dandurand. Who's he? Maigret asked, turning to the concierge. And she, indignant at the intrusion of Nushi, expostulated. I don't know what kind of a yarn she's going to spin you, but I can tell you, saving your presence, that those kids will lie as soon as look at you. Monsieur Dandurand used to be a lawyer, a thoroughly respectable man, very sincere, quiet, and altogether. He occupies the whole of the 4th floor and has done so for years. He goes out for all his meals. He never has any visitors. He'll be back any moment now, I expect. So what? Nushi stated coolly. Monsieur Dandurand is an old pig. Whenever I come down the stairs, he's watching behind his door. What's more, he's followed me into the street. Only last month, as I was passing his door, he signaled me to come in. Madame, saving your presence, held up her hands to the ceiling, as if to say, do we have to listen to this depraved child? Last Monday, I went in, just out of curiosity, and he offered to show me his photographs. It was really rather revolting. He told me that if I would come and visit him sometimes, he'd give me... Don't listen to her, Chief Superintendent. I swear it's the truth. I told Percy about it the very first chance I got, and she went and had a look at the photographs too, and he propositioned her as well. What inducement did he offer? Same as he offered me, a wristwatch. He must keep a stock of them. And I'll tell you something else too. One night, when I couldn't get to sleep, I heard a noise on his landing. I got up and went down and looked in through his keyhole, and I saw him. Hold on, interposed Maigret. Was the staircase light on? She was momentarily disconcerted. He could sense her hesitation. No, she said at last, but there was a moon. How could the moon light the stairs? Through the skylight. There's a skylight just above the landing. This was true. Maigret remembered seeing it. But in that case, why had she hesitated when he had asked her about the staircase light? Thank you, mademoiselle. You may go now. Your parents will be wondering. My parents and my sister have gone to the movies. She looked crestfallen. Surely she hadn't expected Maigret to go up with her to the apartment. Don't you have any other questions to ask me? No. Good evening. Is it true that Cecile is dead? By way of reply, he shut the door on her. It's a disgrace, saving her presence, sighed the concierge. Another glass of wine, Chief Superintendent? I wouldn't put it past her to be taking men up to the apartment in the absence of her parents. Did you see the way she looked at you? It quite made me blush for my own sex. Cars and trucks rumbled endlessly past. Maigret returned to the cane armchair, which creaked under his weight. The concierge got up to refill the stove, and when she sat down again, the cat jumped up on her lap. It was hot. Everything seemed very remote. The cars and trucks belonged to a distant world, almost, as it were, to another planet. With the lodge as the center, the real world was confined within the walls of the building. Above the bed hung the rubber bulb which released the catch of the front door. I take it no one could get into the house without your knowing it. I don't see how. There are 2 keys. What about the shops? The doors leading into the building have been bricked up. Madame Boynet was scared of burglars. You say that, in the past few months, she never left the house. Mind you, she wasn't absolutely helpless. She was able to move about the apartment using a cane. Sometimes she even managed to get as far as the landing, to spy on the tenants or check on whether I'd cleaned the place properly. You never heard her coming. She crept about in felt slippers, and she'd had her cane fitted with a rubber tip. Did she have any visitors? None, except for her nephew, Monsieur Gerard, who would look in from time to time. Mademoiselle Berger never came near her aunt. I believe, saving your presence, that she has a steady boyfriend. I ran to her one Sunday when I was visiting the cemetery, in company with a very respectable-looking gentleman of about 30. I had the feeling that he was a married man. though I couldn't see whether he was wearing a wedding ring. In other words, Madame Boynet lived quite alone with Cécile. That poor girl, so gentle, so devoted. Her aunt treated her like a servant, but she never complained. Now there's one who couldn't be accused of running after men. And besides, she wasn't strong. Her health was far from good. She had stomach aches, but that didn't keep her from carting the garbage can down 5 flights of stairs and going back carrying a bucket of coal. I suppose it was Cécile who took the money to the bank. What bank? I presume that when Madame Boynet received her rent money, she wouldn't have put her money in the bank for all the tea and china. She was far too mistrustful. Come to think of it, I remember now that at the beginning, Monsieur Bonnekel wanted to pay by cheque. What's this? She exclaimed indignantly. Just you go and tell the man that I want cash. Monsieur Bonnekel dug his toes in. He stuck to his guns for a fortnight, but in the end he had to give in. Another glass, Chief Superintendent? I'm not a great one for drink as a rule, saving your presence, but with the right occasion. The bell sounded above the bed. She got up, leaned across the eiderdown, pressed the rubber bulb, and announced, That's Monsieur Deseglis, the tenant of the 3rd floor left. He's an inspector with the bus company. He's on shift work. And to prove it, a man went past the lodge wearing the cap of the municipal bus company. The other tenant on that floor is a piano teacher, a spinster. Her name is Mademoiselle Poucou. Her pupils arrive at hourly intervals, and you can't think how they mess up the stairs when it's raining. I'm surprised Monsieur Dandurand isn't back yet. When I think of what that impudent kid dared to insinuate, those little minxes, vicious as they are, wouldn't think twice about putting a man behind bars just to draw attention to themselves. Did you see the way she looked at you? You, an elderly married man and a public official. I know what that means, because my husband was a public official himself. He worked on the railroad. Ah, good. Here is Monsieur Dandurand. She got up and once again leaned across the bed to press the rubber bulb. Lights came on in the hall and on the stairs. The soft swish of an umbrella being closed was followed by the careful scraping of shoes on the mat. You won't find him leaving dirty marks all over the place. A dry cough, slow, measured footsteps, the door of the lodge opened. Any mail from me, Madame Benoît? Nothing tonight, saving your presence, Monsieur Dandurand. A man of 70, with a grey complexion and grey hair, dressed all in black, carrying a damp umbrella. As he raised his eyes to meet the chief superintendent's, Maigret frowned, feeling sure that he had seen him somewhere before. And yet, when he had first heard the name Dandurand a little while ago, it had meant nothing to him. He was sure he knew the man. He searched his memory. Where could it have been? You are Chief Superintendent Maigret, aren't you? Said the tenant quietly, still standing in the doorway. Would you believe it, Chief Superintendent? I have just come from your office. I know it's outside office hours, but I am also aware that occasionally A name leaped into Maigret's mind. Monsieur Charles. Suddenly he was convinced that there was a connection between the name and the man who stood before him. Now what was it that name conveyed to him? A small cafe patronized by... Is there something urgent you have to tell me? Well, I thought if you would be so kind as to come up to my apartment for a moment. Excuse us, Madame Benoît. Forgive me, Chief Superintendent, for putting you to the trouble of climbing 4 flights of stairs. I have only just learned at the Quai des Sauveurs that poor Mademoiselle Cécile. I confess it was a great shock. Maigret got up and followed Monsieur Dandurand up the stairs. I could see you recognize me, even if you couldn't recall. We'd better hurry, or we'll be left in the dark. He felt in his pocket for his key and inserted it in the lock. Maigret looked up and saw Nushi, in shadowy outline, leaning over the banisters. No sooner had he done so than a blob of spittle landed with a plop at their feet. Monsieur Dandurand was sensitive to cold. He was wearing a coat even thicker and heavier than Maigret's, and a long woolen muffler wound around his neck. He was unhealthy and unkempt, looking like so many elderly bachelors, and his apartment smelled as he did of stale pipe smoke, soiled underwear, and solitude. One moment, I'll switch on the light. His study might have been that of a lawyer or a business consultant. Dark furniture, black shelves filled with law books, tables covered with green file boxes, periodicals, and documents. You do smoke, I think? He himself had a row of 10 or so pipes carefully set out on his desk. Having first pulled the blind down over the window, he filled one for himself. Do you still not remember me? Admittedly, we only met twice. The first time at Chez Albert, on Rue Blanche. I know, Monsieur Charles. The other time, in my office at the Quai des Ouvert, 8 years ago. I had a few questions to ask you, and I must admit that you had an answer to everything. A cold smile, a frozen smile on a frozen face, colorless but for a tinge of pink in the fleshy nose. Please take a seat. I was out this morning. May I ask where you were? Now that I know what's happened, I realize that this is going to look bad for me. All the same, I may as well admit that I spent a good deal of my time in the Palais de Justice. Owing to my former connection with the law, I dare say I can't seem to lose the habit ever since you were disbarred in Fontenay-le-Comte. A fake shrug, as if to say, just so, but it's of so little consequence. And the former lawyer from the provinces went on. I spent most of my time at the courts. Take today, for instance, there was a most interesting case being heard in Court 13, a case of blackmail within a family. Maître Boniface, who represented the son-in-law, Monsieur Dandurand, formerly Maître Dandurand, who had been living in one of the oldest private residences in Fontenay, was forever cracking his stiff finger joints. Please stop fidgeting with your fingers and tell me what you went to see me about in my office, sighed Maigret, relighting his pipe, which had gone out. I'm so sorry. When I left the house at 8 o'clock this morning, I was unaware of what had happened in the apartment upstairs. It was until 4 o'clock in the Palais that one of my friends, you learned of the murder of Madame Juliette Boynet, née Casanova, who, like yourself, came from Fontenay-le-Comte. That is so, Chief Superintendent. I came back home, but you were not here. I prefer to say nothing to the policeman on duty outside. I returned my streetcar to the Quai des Ouvert. You must have been on your way here by then. Chief Superintendent Cassieux, who knows me. You must indeed be known under the name of Monsieur Charles to the head of the 5 squad. Dandurand went on as though he had not heard. Chief Superintendent Cassieux told me about Cécile and about... Maigret got up and tiptoed across the tiny hallway, the door leading to which stood ajar, when abruptly he flung open the front door. Nushi, whose eye had been glued to the keyhole, almost fell flat on her face. She straightened up just in time and was off up the stairs like greased lightning. You were saying, knowing that I should find you here, I decided to have dinner first. Then I had to wait some time for a streetcar on Place Saint-Michel, but here I am at last. I wanted to tell you myself that I was in Madame Boynet's apartment last night, sometime between midnight and 1 o'clock. She and I were friends, and I was, in a sense, a professional advisor. Without realizing what he was doing, he cracked his finger joints again, and then hastily murmured an apology. Forgive me, old habits die hard.
Maigret and a Spinster by George Simenon. Part 1, Chapter 4.
It was a little after 10 o'clock at night. Madame Maigret, having finished turning down the big double bed, was standing in front of the glass-fronted wardrobe beside it, putting her hair in curlers with the aid of hairpins that she was holding in her mouth. Boulevard Richard Lenoir was deserted. The main road beyond the Porte d'Orléans was also deserted, glinting under the rain, but only a few seconds later a procession of 3, 4, 6 cars appeared on it, preceded by a broad beam of brilliant light. These headlights, as they were passed, barely brushed against Madame Boynet's house, disproportionately tall as it was, and the uglier of having no neighboring houses to conceal its rough-hewn sides. Madame Piéchaud's grocery store was still showing a light. The proprietress was sitting in front of the stove in the shop to save fuel. On the other side of the front door of the building, the bicycle shop was dark, except for a patch of light from the open door to the back room, where there could be seen a bed and a young man polishing shoes. The Sibuchis had gone to the movies. The concierge, reluctant to go to bed while Maigret was still in the house, was consoling herself by finishing a bottle of red wine, while at the same time entertaining her cat with a commentary on the events of the day. Over there at the forensic laboratory, far away on the other side of Paris, 2 bodies lay in drawers in that vast human cold storage plant. In Monsieur Dandurand's apartment, Maigret puffed at his pipe, avoiding, as best he could, looking the former lawyer in the eye. The apartment, it seemed, was never aired, since all the usual household smells were blended in a sickening, musty staleness that seeped into one's clothing and clung for a long time afterward. Tell me, Monsieur Dandurand, if I'm not mistaken, it was in connection with a vice charge, was it not, that you were forced to leave Fontenay? Let's see. It's ancient history by now, but your name came up at police headquarters only a few weeks back. You got 2 years. That's right, the lawyer replied coolly. And Maigret huddled deeper into his heavy overcoat, as if to insulate himself against any physical contact with this man. He had not taken off his hat. In spite of his apparent grumpiness, Maigret was very generous toward most forms of human weakness, but there were some people who so revolted him that he physically shrank from them. Monsieur Dandurand was among them. This revulsion was so deep-seated that Maigret was never wholly at ease in the presence of his colleague Cassieux, who, as head of the vice squad, was in charge of all matters connected with personal morality. It was Cassieux who had spoken to him of this man, generally known as Monsieur Charles, a lawyer from the provinces, who had been mixed up in a nasty case concerning the corruption of miners, and had served a 2-year term before landing up in Paris. He was a rather unusual case, conducive to reflections on the strangeness of human destiny, barred from the exercise of his profession, and swallowed up in the capital city where he was unknown. Dandurand, still possessed of an ample income from investments, was able freely to gratify his vicious tastes. He was one of those stingy, somewhat repulsive, shifty-eyed men who during daytime keep in the shadows and only come to life when they are elbowing their way through the crowds in pursuit of a likely victim. The former lawyer had been spotted loitering near the Porte Saint-Martin, Boulevard Sébastopol, and the Bastille, one of the many furtive characters that haunt factory gates and the exits of big stores, and who, at nightfall, scuffle, hunched up and muffled, into the dark doorway of some disreputable establishment catering to their special tastes. Needless to say, he was familiar with all such establishments, and was well known to those who ran them. "Hello, Monsieur Charles. Let me see. What have I got for you today?" He was at home in such places. They had become the breath of life to him, and he needed to go there every day. It did not take long for the other habitués to discover that he had formerly been a lawyer. He was occasionally asked to give legal advice. By now, he had joined the chosen few who were admitted behind the scenes. He was no longer received as a client, but as a friend. "If you heard that the house on Rue d'Antin is up for sale, Dédé has had some trouble, and he's leaving next week for South America, with 500,000 francs to his credit." Maigret seemed to be lost in a dream. His head lowered, he was staring at the faded red-fitted carpet. Suddenly he started. He thought he had heard a sound from the floor above. For a second, he had imagined it came from Madame Boynet's apartment, the thought of Cécile. "It's only Nushi," said Monsieur Dandurand, with a characteristically mirthless smile. Obviously, since Cécile was dead. Cécile was dead. At that very moment, the chief commissioner of the police judiciaire, playing bridge at a friend's house, was briefly describing the scene in the broom closet, the body hunched against the wall, the tall figure of Maigret bending over it. What did he say? Nothing. He just stood there with his hands in his pockets. I think he was harder hit than at any time during his career. Then he left the building. I would be greatly surprised if he got any sleep tonight. Poor old Maigret. Maigret tapped out his pipe on the heel of his shoe, emptying the ash onto the carpet. "Did you look after Madame Boynet's business interests?" he asked, speaking slowly with a wry mouth, as if the words had a bitter taste. I knew her and her sister in Fontenay-le-Comte. You might also say we were neighbors. It was only when I took a lease on this apartment that I discovered she owned the building. She was a widow by that time. You never knew her when she was alive, did you? I wouldn't go so far as to say that she was mad, but she was certainly something of an eccentric. She was obsessed with money. She kept her entire fortune in the apartment because she was terrified of being robbed by the banks. Very much to your advantage, I don't doubt. It did not take much effort of imagination for Maigret to envisage this man worming his way into the confidence of the elderly women who ran the establishments which he patronized. Later, Monsieur Dandurand had taken a step up the ladder and become acquainted with the landlords, whom he would join in a game of belote in the evenings in some bar in Montmartre. Thus, Maître Charles Dandurand, lawyer from Fontenay, had been transformed into Monsieur Charles, advisor and associate of these gentlemen, who reposed great trust in him, since, being in the know as he was, he could be extremely useful to them in many ways. It was all to her advantage, chief superintendent. His long, bloodless, hairy hands fidgeted with the pipes on the table. His nostrils also sprouted tufts of grey hair. Surely you must have heard of old Juliet. It's true, you've always specialized in murder. But your colleague, Cassieux, it all started with the house on Rue d'Antin, which was up for sale. I mentioned it to Madame Boynet, whom I always called Juliet, since we had known one another from the time when we were young. Juliet bought it. A year later, I acquired Le Paradis in Béziers on her behalf, and that is one of the most profitable establishments of its kind in the country. Does she know what sort of place you were investing her money in? Look, Chief Superintendent, I've known a few mices in my time. A lawyer in the provinces meets all sorts of people, but their greed was nothing in comparison with Juliet's. Money had a sort of mystical fascination for her. Ask anyone in the milieu, as you call it at police headquarters. Ask them how many of their establishments are owned by Juliet. Allow me to quote you a few figures. He got up and took from a wall safe a grubby ledger. As he turned over the pages, he licked his unsavory fingers. Last year, I remitted to Juliet 590,000 francs in bills, a profit of 590,000 francs, and she kept all that money in her apartment. I have every reason to believe she did, as she had ceased to be able to go out herself, and she would never have entrusted her niece with such large sums of money. Oh, I can guess what you're thinking. I realize that what has happened puts me in a false position, but I give you my word, Chief Superintendent, that you are mistaken. I've never done anyone out of a single penny. Ask any of the people concerned. I don't have to tell you that they're not the sort to permit any irregularity to go unpunished. Any one of them will tell you that Monsieur Charles is on the level. Would you care for a refill of tobacco? Maigret declined the proffered tobacco pouch and took his own out of his pocket. No thanks. As you prefer. I'm doing my best to give you a truthful account. As Albert would say, I'm spilling the beans. This slang expression was accompanied by an odd smile. After all, this was a man who had spent the greater part of his life in the society of the most God-fearing citizens of Fontenay. Juliet had a bee in the bonnet about keeping the nature of her investment secret. She dreaded discovery. Mark you, she never saw a soul. There was nobody to poke his nose into her affairs. All the same, she went to absurd lengths. It was almost touching to prevent discovery. For the past 6 months or more, since she first became housebound, I have been under orders to visit her clandestinely in her apartment. You wouldn't believe the shifts I was put to on the days when I had to call on her. Footsteps on the stairs. The Siverchis had returned. They could be heard talking loudly in Hungarian, and by the time they reached the floor above, a regular row had broken out. Every morning, the tenants' newspapers are delivered to the lodge. The concierge sorts them out and puts them in the appropriate pigeonholes with the mail. I had to contrive to mark Juliet's paper with a penciled cross when I collected my own. Poor Cécile, who suspected nothing, would come down and fetch her aunt's paper a few minutes later. That same night, at midnight, I would creep upstairs without making a sound. Juliette would be waiting for me at the door, leaning on her cane. The entire staff of the police judiciaire had openly laughed at Cécile for suggesting that furniture and ornaments had been moved during the night. Did the niece sleep through it all? Cécile. Her aunt saw to it that she did. If you have searched the apartment, as I presume you have, you must have found several bottles of sleeping pills in the drawer. On the nights when Juliette was expecting me, she always made sure that Cécile would sleep very soundly, and, forgive me, I haven't offered you a drink. What will you have? Nothing, thank you. I see. You're on the wrong track, Chief Superintendent. Of course, you don't have to believe me, but I do assure you that I couldn't so much as wring the neck of a chicken, and I turned faint at the sight of blood. Madame Boynet was strangled. At this, the former lawyer seemed momentarily taken aback. He looked down at his bloodless hands. That, too, would be beyond me. Besides, it was not in my own interest to... Tell me, Monsieur Dandurand, according to your calculations, how much money did Madame Boynet keep in the apartment? Approximately 800,000 francs. Do you know where this money was hidden? She never told me. Knowing her as I did, I presumed that she never let it out of her hands, that it must be somewhere within her reach, and that, in a manner of speaking, she went to bed with her fortune. And yet none of it has been found. Presumably, she also had papers, the deeds of her various properties, and so on. They have vanished from her desk. What time did you return to your apartment last night? Between 1 and half past. According to the pathologist, Madame Boynet was killed at around 2 o'clock in the morning. The concierge states that no one entered the building. One more question. Did anything occur while you were in the apartment to suggest that Cécile might not be asleep? Nothing. Think hard. Are you absolutely sure you couldn't have left something behind in the apartment which might have made it possible for her to suspect that you had been there? Monsieur Charles thought for a moment, but did not seem bothered by the question. I don't see... That's all I wanted to know. Naturally, I must ask you not to leave Paris. Indeed, I should prefer it if you wouldn't leave your apartment. I understand. Maigret was already at the front door. Sorry, I almost forgot. Do your friends often visit you here? He stressed the word friends. Not one of them has ever set foot in this building. I'm a careful man myself, Chief Superintendent. Not excessively careful, like my friend Juliette. I'm not obsessional. My friends, as you call them, don't know where I live and communicate with me through a post office box number. Still less would they be likely to know Madame Boynet's address. They don't even know her real name. In fact, a lot of people believe that Juliette didn't really exist, that she was a convenient fiction dreamed up by me for my own purposes. More footsteps on the stairs, the voice of the concierge, out of breath. Just a minute, Monsieur Gerard. And she called out, Chief Superintendent! Chief Superintendent! Maigret opened the door and pressed the time switch to turn on the light, which had just gone out. A young man in a state of intense agitation, a stranger to him, stood trembling before him. Where is my sister? He demanded, looking wide-eyed at Maigret. This is Monsieur Gerard, explained Madame Benoît. He burst in like a madman. I told him that Mademoiselle Cécile... Please return to your apartment, Monsieur Dandurand, snapped Maigret. The door to the Siverchys' apartment had been opened. Another door opened on the floor below. Come with me, Monsieur Gerard. You may return to your lodge, Madame Benoît. The chief superintendent had the key to the dead woman's apartment in his pocket. He ushered the young man in and bolted the door. Have you really only just heard? Is it true? Is Cécile dead? Who told you? The concierge. The apartment had been turned inside out by the technicians from the forensic laboratory. Drawers and cupboards had been searched and the contents scattered all over the place. I want to know about my sister. Yes, Cécile is dead. Gerard was in such a state of nervous tension that he was not even able to shed a tear. He looked about him in utter bewilderment, his face twitching so horribly that it was painful to watch. It's not possible. Where is she? He made a dive for his sister's bedroom, but the chief superintendent restrained him. She's not here. Take it easy. Wait. He remembered having seen a bottle of rum in a cupboard. He got it and held it out to the young man. Have a drink. How did you find out? I was in a cafe when... Forgive me. I'm going to ask you a few questions. It's the quickest way. What were you doing this afternoon? I went to 3 different addresses. I was looking for a job. What sort of job? Gerhard replied with a wry smile. Anything I could get. My wife is expecting a baby any day now. Our landlord has given us notice. Did you go back home for dinner? No, I was in this cafe. It was only then that Maigret realized that Gerhard, though perhaps not exactly drunk, had been drinking a little too freely. Were you looking for a job in this cafe? A hard, hostile stare. You too. But of course, just like my wife. How can you know what it's like to chase after non-existent jobs from morning till night? Do you know what I did last week? 3 nights running. No, of course not. As if you cared. Well, I unloaded vegetables at the market just to be able to buy food. Tonight, I went to the cafe to meet someone who had promised me a job. Who was that? I don't know his name. He's tall and red-headed, and he sells radio equipment. What was the name of the cafe? Do you suspect me of killing my aunt? He was shaking from head to foot, and seemed on the point of hurling himself like a madman to the chief superintendent. The Canon de la Bastille, if you really want to know. I live on Rue de Pas de la Mule. My friend didn't show up. I didn't want to go back home without. Haven't you had any dinner? What's that got to do with you? Someone had left a newspaper behind on the table. As usual, I looked first at the small ads. You can't imagine what it's like, plowing through the small ads, knowing, oh well. He waved a hand, as if to brush away a nightmare. And suddenly, there it was on page 3, my aunt's name. I couldn't take it in at first. It was just a few lines. Landlady strangled in bed in Berger. Last night, Madame Juliette Boynet, a real estate owner living in Berger, was... What time was this? I don't know. It's a long time since I last owned a watch. About 9:30, maybe. I hurried back home. I told Helene. Your wife, you mean? Yes. I told her that my aunt was dead, and I caught the bus. Did you by any chance stop for a drink first? Just a small glass to buck me up. I couldn't understand why Cécile hadn't let me know. I presume you have expectations from your aunt? Yes, my 2 sisters and I are her heirs. I waited for a streetcar at the Châtelet and... But about Cécile. Why was Cécile killed? The concierge has just told me. Cécile was killed because she knew the name of the murderer, Maigret said slowly. The young man, showing no signs of calming down, stretched out his hand for the bottle of rum, but the chief superintendent intervened. No, that's enough. Sit down. What you could really do with is a cup of strong coffee. Are you insinuating? His tone was aggressive. As far as he was concerned, Maigret was the enemy. You're not running away with the idea that I murdered my aunt and my sister, I hope, he shouted, in a sudden spurt of rage. Maigret made the mistake of not answering. It was not intentional. He was in the throes of one of his fits of abstraction. Or rather, to be more precise, he had just completed the imaginative leap needed to bring the interior of the apartment to life. The same apartment a few years earlier. The eccentric aunt, the 3 children, Cécile as an adolescent and her sister Bertha with her hair still loose, and Gerhard planning to get away from it all by enlisting. He started. The young man had seized him by the collar of his coat and was yelling, "Why don't you answer? Do you believe I..." A powerful smell of spirits. Maigret shrank back and seized the young man by the wrists. "Easy, my boy," he murmured. "Relax." He had forgotten his own strength and was holding the boy's wrists in a grip of steel. "You're hurting me," he whimpered. At long last, his eyes overflowed with tears.